signal detection isn't about dots on a screen or beeps in a lab. It's about one of the most dangerous words in psychology, which is probably. So probably they're interested. Probably it's nothing. Probably they're telling the truth. So today we're going to learn and dive in more about why that idea of probably creates false alarms, creates misses, and why power and having power actually can make those errors worse. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today when we continue our deep dive into the human mind and all the sort of wonderful factors that go into that idea of perceiving the world so that you can take action on the world. But if you're going to take action on the world, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision based on what you perceived. And that is what we're going to take a look at today when we take a look at signal detection. So how do you know to actually reach for that particular book? How do you know to actually go to that particular library? All of these basic, trivial, sometimes yes-no decisions can be understood in a signal detection paradigm. And then once you understand that trivial decisions can be understood in a signal detection paradigm, as we're going to see today, very many important life decisions, as long as they're yes or no, can be analyzed helpfully in that signal detection paradigm. So before we get back to our look at how signal detection helps us measure sensitivity, helps us to distinguish between people that perform differently when they're perceiving the world, but might behave the same because they have different response criteria, as we saw with our individual on the left who doesn't hear anything and our individual on the right with super sensitive hearing. So we're going to dive into that again. We're going to have a quick review just to start off, just to kind of refresh your memory on signal detection. And then we're going to spend most of the day on real world applications and real world implications of this. And one of the big topics that we're going to tackle is the idea of sexual harassment and what happened after the Me Too movement. And we're also going to take a look at power and biases that exist in sexual interest and how to understand that from a signal detection paradigm. So we're going to start off with some more safe real world examples, and then we're going to get into some dangerous territory with signal detection. So quick recap. Signal detection measures the sensitivity of a perceptual system. So that's the ability of an organism or an organ to detect or respond to external stimuli. So that is one of the basic things you want to know about any perceptual system. What is the minimum that is required in order for that system to be activated? And that sensitivity is measured in signal detection with D prime. And that is defined as the distance between the signal and noise distributions using that signal detection paradigm. And as we saw, that noise distribution is basically the random, not signal evidence in a system that can trick you into thinking that a signal is there. So the example that we used is in a classroom. If you're a teacher and you're trying to determine which student to call on, you're looking for hands that are raised. So any movement in that classroom that is not a student raising their hand, any hand that goes up for reasons other than a student wanting to answer a question or be called on, any of those is noise that's in the system. And in signal detection theory, we see that there is always noise in the system. And we saw that with the example of John Cage, who wanted to hear silence, went to that anechoic chamber and heard two tones. The high-pitched tone was his nervous system operating. The low-pitched tone was his blood circulating. There's always noise in the system. So that noise and the signal exist on this axis of evidence. So you have very little evidence all the way to the left that a signal is present. You have a lot of evidence all the way to the right that the signal is present. And then we have the frequency or number of times that certain amounts of evidence exist in the world. And your noise distribution is the amount of evidence that exists in the world when there's no signal. So that is just a kind of random motion of students in the classroom. That is the high-pitched sound in your nervous system when you're trying to listen for other sounds. There's always noise in the system, and very infrequently, very rarely, do you get a lot of evidence from that noise. Very rarely does that noise produce a lot of evidence. It does sometimes, which is that one little smiley face down there. And then very rarely is there extremely small amounts of noise. Most of the time, there is a sort of average amount of noise, and that is the height of this bell curve. The highest point is the typical amount of noise that there are, and there's your distribution of the noise that you're going to encounter. So this bell curve here basically indicates the frequency with which you're going to encounter noise that looks like evidence in your system. So because the noise is always there, when you have a signal, it's not just a signal distribution, it's your signal plus noise distribution, because the evidence from the signal is getting added to that noise distribution. So what that means is that your new signal plus noise distribution, this is when the signal is present, looks exactly like your noise distribution alone. It's just that you have now moved it up because that signal has actually produced evidence. So you might have a student that is moving and you're wondering, oh, does this person want me to call on them? But then they put their hand up. So they're still kind of moving, but now their hand is up. They have a signal plus noise, and that is the evidence that you now have that they want to be called on. And then we saw that the distance between those two peaks, that's your measure of sensitivity. And then the last piece is that in order to operate in the world and make a decision, you set a criterion where any evidence that you encounter above that criterion, you're going to say, yes, the signal is present. Any evidence that you encounter below that criterion, you're going to say, no, the signal is not present. And then what that gives us is it gives us 4 possible outcomes. So when the signal is not present, the times when the noise distribution gives you evidence that is beyond your criterion, to the right of your criterion, that little area over there, that is misses. Sorry, that is false alarms. So you say, yes, there's a signal, but there actually isn't a signal. The noise distribution that falls below that criterion of that criterion line, those are known as correct rejections. So we have the correct rejections, there's nothing there, and you correctly say there's nothing there. And then we have the false alarms. There's nothing there, but because of that just random variation of noise, it just happened to cross over your criterion line, and you falsely say, oh yeah, I detect something, and that's a false alarm. And then when the signal is added to the noise, now the correct answer would be yes. The signal is there. This is when the signal is present. That's how much evidence is there. And if that is above the level of your criterion, you say, yes, a signal is present. And since the signal is present, that's a hit. But if that evidence falls below the criterion, then you say, no, there's nothing there. And there is something there, so we call those misses. And then those are the 4 outcomes of your signal detection theory. And again, with those 4 outcomes, when we measure them, for example, in a lab setting, you can measure the distance between the peaks. There's a mathematical formula to figure that out. And the further or the larger the distance is between the peaks, the more sensitive you are and the better you are at detecting when a signal is there and rejecting when a signal isn't. Because when those 2 peaks are close together, you can see we have a lot of misses and we have a lot of false alarms. But if those 2 signals or those 2 distributions get further apart, the misses go down and the false alarms go down. And that lets us know that you are more sensitive in this particular situation. All right, and then the final thing that's going to be very important for today's look at a lot of these issues is that your criterion is not fixed. And sometimes you're going to be in a situation where you say to yourself, you know what, false alarms are not very costly, but misses are really costly. So I'm going to adopt this particular criterion because it leads to very little false alarms. and it leads to an acceptable amount of misses. However, you might be in another situation where false alarms are very uncostly, but misses are painfully costly. And if that's a situation, you might say, well, I got to move my criterion to where now I have a lot of false alarms, but it's okay. They're not going to cost me much, but I'm going to reduce the number of misses that I have. So when we determine how we're going to respond in a particular situation, whether we're going to say yes or we're going to say no, what we do in our minds, whether we're aware of it or not, is we calculate out how bad is it to have a false alarm? How bad is it to have a miss? How beneficial is it to have a hit? How beneficial is it to have a correct rejection? And then basically we make a determination and decide where our criterion is in order to maximally benefit, our desired outcome. Okay, so that's the setup. Now we're going to do the transfer. So in this case, the content of each of these decisions that we're going to go through is a simple yes or no. Signal detection requires that you have a yes or no decision. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to map the 4 outcomes correctly and then just have a discussion about what we feel is the worst errors to make. So the first situation that we're going to take a look at is applying to grad school. So when you're applying to grad schools, it's a yes or no decision. So you take a look at a grad school and you're either going to say to yourself, yes, I will apply to this grad school, or no, I will not apply to this grad school. So if we have that situation of deciding whether we're going to apply or not apply, there is noise in that situation. And in this case, the noise would be when there is no signal, basically when there is no chance, I won't say no chance, basically when you're not going to get into a grad program. So the noise distribution here is if your application is going to get rejected. So you don't know this ahead of time, but the noise is that your application will get rejected. And then the signal is that your application will get accepted. And we're going to have evidence here that will tell you that your application is more likely to get accepted, or it's going to tell you that your application is more likely to get rejected. So before we start thinking about where our criterion line is, whether or not we send the application or don't apply for that decision, what are some of the sorts of evidence that we would be looking for here that would either be part of the actual evidence that your application will be accepted, or maybe part of the noise that your application will get rejected? What kind of evidence might be beneficial for you to know if you're going to apply somewhere? Mm-hmm.
How many applicants there are and how many they're accepting?
Okay, so evidence about whether or not you are likely to get in. How many applications do they typically get, and how many are they actually accepting? So if a university has an acceptance rate of 80%, that is good evidence that your application is going to get accepted. If that university has an acceptance rate of 2%, that is an indication that your application is probably going to get rejected. So that application acceptance rate is evidence. The higher the acceptance rate, the more likely that you're going to fall into that application accepted. Any other signals or potential noises? Mm-hmm. So your GPA is another thing that will let you know whether or not, or give you evidence whether or not your application is going to get accepted or rejected, especially if the university has a hard cutoff. So if the university says, hey, our cutoff GPA for applications is 3.5, and don't even bother applying if you don't have a 3.5. Well, that's really strong evidence that if you have a 3.4, you're going to get rejected, right? But if you have a 3.5 or higher, then it's more evidence that you are going to get accepted. And I keep saying more evidence because, as you can see here, there's really no guarantee that you will get accepted. And that's one of the reasons why signal detection theory is so helpful, because again, it lives in that world of probably. And just as a side kind of anecdote for this, when I was teaching statistics, I wanted to come up with a statistics problem that had to do with acceptance rates at universities. And I would just wanted to take a look at Harvard, because Harvard is, one of the most famous universities. And what was its acceptance rate? And its acceptance rate, if I remember this correctly, was 2%. And right underneath where it said acceptance rate 2%, it literally said, even if you have a 4.0 and you have perfect SATs and you have tons of, great reference letters, still consider applying to other schools as well, because that's no guarantee that you're going to get in. So you can, again, the university that you're applying to and their acceptance rate, evidence that you might get in. Does anybody have any suggestions maybe for what might be noise here? Things that well, I mean, there wouldn't actually be, I was thinking about noise that might be universal noise. Yeah, you have an idea?
I was gonna say, going to try and find places to apply maybe other grad programs on the website. It's like, oh, is this another program I can apply to? You have to click a bunch of things and be like, oh, no, I don't know what grad programs are.
Yeah, I guess that would be, noise is anything that looks like evidence, but that is not actually a signal being there. So something like, the announcing of a new grad program might be noise, because if it's coming this year, then it's actually evidence. But if it's coming 2 years from now, then it's actually noise. And you might say to yourself, oh, they've announced a new grad program. Now I can get into that program. It ups my chances. They're expanding. But if the expansion isn't until 2028, then it's noise. It's not going to help you in your current applications. So as you can see, there's a lot of different sources of evidence that increases your chances that you're going to get in, things that are not necessarily evidence that you're going to get in or you're not going to get in. So thinking about this, one of my biggest kind of examples or ideas of where noise might come from is just in the application process, things like a personal statement. I have never had a student come to me applying to grad school and asking me, what is a GPA? Right? They're all like, oh yeah, no, I know my GPA. That's solid. What's a GRE score or an SAT score? They know that. That's solid knowledge. What should I put in my personal statement is a huge question. And it's because there's nothing but noise there. Nobody can really they can give you sort of like guidelines, but nobody can say the way that you can do it for a GPA, which is like, this is what you need. In a personal statement, there's things that can improve your personal statement, but nobody really knows what somebody might be looking for. So again, that idea of I'm going to put in this in my personal statement can be seen as noise, because we don't know if that's going to be signal or not. We don't know if that's what they're looking for. Okay, so that's a lot of good suggestions on what would be taken as evidence. Okay, so we have two decisions. Don't apply or send your application. Let's say that we decide to not apply. Let's say that this is the situation right here where our application, unknown to us, but our application is going to get rejected. All right, the signal detection paradigm knows this in advance, let's just say. So our application is going to get rejected, and we decide not to apply, and we make the correct decision. What is that known as? Which of the four decisions does that map to? That is your correct rejection. Now, let's say that we decided to apply to some universities, and unknown to us, we weren't going to get into those universities. And those are the universities there. Based on the evidence that we believed indicated a signal, we applied, but we were incorrect. And what are those known as? Those are your false alarms. So when you send in that application, but you had no possible chance of getting into that university, that is a false alarm. And then we have the universities that will accept your applications, the programs that you will get into. And that is your signal plus noise distribution here. And then we have the places where you sent your application and you got accepted into that situation. And in the signal detection paradigm, those are known as, yep, those are your hits. And then we have one last section, one last possibility. And those are the grad schools that would have accepted you into their program, but you decided not to apply to those particular grad schools. And anyone just yell it out? What are those? Those are your misses. All right, so those are the 4 situations here. Now, let me ask you, anybody that's kind of planning on applying to grad school, anybody that has thought about this issue, which one would you say? And again, there's one of the things that we'll see here is there's no right or wrong answer because this changes for every particular individual. But what would you say would be the most costly mistake in this situation? Would it be the misses or would it be the false alarms? Mm-hmm. So what is the cost of the miss?
You won't be able to go to a certain program, maybe the one you like, be a better one than the one that you think that you'll be able to get into if you undervalue yourself.
Okay, so there's a cost to the misses, right? There's a cost to missing out on applying to a grad school program. You might not get into the one that you wanted. You might not get in, it might have been a better grad school program that would have given you more opportunities, that would have led to a higher paying job, that would have led to a better placement in, whatever area of work or career that you're trying to pursue. So those misses can be extremely costly. What is the cost of a false alarm? Yep.
The application fee.
So cost of a false alarm is the application fee. That's one of the big ones. What is another one? It's kind of like a hidden cost. Yep.
Rejection.
The rejection, I didn't think about that, but rejection doesn't feel good, right? So there's a psychological cost to opening, that email and reading the thank you for your application, but we regret to inform you. It was a very competitive field this year. I've seen those myself. Yep. There's time spent applying, right? These applications are extensive, and you can reuse a lot of what you've written for multiple applications, but a lot of them you have to change as you go through. It takes time. It takes money. There's psychological costs to that rejection. But if we were looking at this and we were saying, all right, the cost of an application, the financial cost of applying and not getting in, the psychological cost of rejection, right? That those few days or maybe a week that you're going to feel bad, the time cost that you're going to do in putting this application together. If you decide that that is small compared to the cost of the miss, compared to not getting into a grad program that you would have gotten into, then what you would do is you can't get better at predicting which grad school you're going to get into. But what you can do in this situation is you can say, look, false alarms are not that bad. Misses are really bad. So what I'm going to do is instead of having a conservative criterion, I'm going to have a very liberal criterion. And I'm going to increase the number of false alarms. I'm going to send more grad school applications. I'm going to budget a little bit more for the ones that charge a fee. I'm going to skip some weekends doing what I want to make sure that I get all these applications in. I'm going to pay the cost of false alarms because your mind has determined that the false alarm cost is much less than the misses, the cost of misses. So you adjust your criteria accordingly. And the same kind of thing that you do in this case with grad school, for those of you that are not going the grad school route, is the exact same thing with job interviews. When you're looking at those job applications and you're thinking to yourself, do I apply to this job? Do I not apply to this job? Again, you're going to take a look at what is the cost of a false alarm? What is the cost of a miss? And that's one of the reasons oftentimes why when we do, for example, a job search to find another professor here at IUSB. So for example, Dr. Day Bryant recently retired. So we're going to be hopefully looking for somebody to replace her, or replace her position, because she is pretty wonderful. We will put out a call for applications, and we will put in the evidence. This is what we're looking for. This is what we want. And we will get many applications that don't meet that criteria, that fall short, that we sort of can just immediately look at and say, well, they didn't meet the minimum criteria that we were looking at. Why did we get those applications? Why did people decide to send it in? It's because the cost of a false alarm in this case is very, very low. They had to put their application together, they sent it off, and it's low for the false alarm, but it's high for the miss. Because if they could have gotten a job here, if they could have gotten on a tenure track position, that could be a career in a place. So when you take a look at it that way, false alarm, very minimal cost, miss, very massive cost. You move your criterion back to be a more liberal criterion because you can't get away from that trade-off of false alarms and misses. You can just choose which ones you're going to have instead of the other ones. All right, so that was a pretty heavy example. Let's go a little bit lighter, and let's take the example. This is a social example of waving to somebody. So when you see somebody walking down the street and they do this, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision, do I wave back? Or you have to make the decision of, do I not wave back? So in this case, we have, once again, a yes, no decision, wave or not wave. We have evidence at the bottom there. And in this case, let's talk about the let's talk about the decision to waive or not waive. You are correct. That is the signal plus noise distribution. If somebody is waving at you, so socially in our society, if somebody waves at you, it is the correct decision to wave back at them. If that person was waving at somebody else, then the correct decision is not to wave at that particular individual. So in this scenario, waving at somebody that's waving at you, that's a hit. Not waving at them because they're waving at somebody else, that's a correct rejection. What is a miss in this scenario? Mm-hmm. So a miss in this scenario is that they were waving at you, but you did not wave back. And what might the cost of that be in, in our society? Yep.
The person who waved back, who waved at you, could think that you were being rude by not waving back at them.
Right. So they might think that you're being rude. They might think that you are just in general being antagonistic to them. And that puts a cost on their relationship, right? So the next time that you come and you see that person, you're probably going to have to explain. They're probably going to say, hey, I saw you, last week I waved at you. What happened? Like, are we not friends anymore? You kind of snubbed me or whatever. Or, if it's less of a kind of strong relationship, you might come to them and you might need a favor, and they think in the back of their head, well, who's this person? They didn't wave at me last time. I thought, we at least were, work friends, but I guess not. So there's a cost. There's a social cost to not waving at somebody that's waving at you. What about the false alarms? What is the cost there?
They wave you way back when there's someone else. The cost of time, you feel embarrassed.
Right. So false alarm is when you wave at somebody, but they were actually waving at somebody else. And I think we've all had that experience where you see somebody and you think they're waving at you and you're like, oh, and then you see the person behind and they're like, George, and it's like, Jim, and you're like, oh my gosh, I just kind of want to die, right? There's a cost, right? There's a social embarrassment. And then depending upon how much you ruminate on things, you might sit there thinking to yourself, well, are they talking about me now? Is this going to be, their topic of conversation for the next hour? What must they think of me? But there is that cost. It's not for free. And then one of the other things, we're not going to spend too much time on this, but one of the things to kind of appreciate in these signal detection scenarios is that the costs depend upon the situation that you're in. So if you take a look at a scenario like this one, where you're just walking down the street and where's my wave? There we go. If you take a look at a scenario like this one, where you're just walking down the street and somebody waves at you and you think to yourself, all right, you know what? Maybe I know them, maybe I don't. I'm just going to wave. If it's embarrassing, it's embarrassing, but I don't want to snub, a friend or a potential burgeoning relationship. So I'm just going to wave at them. Your idea to return the wave because you think they're waving at you will probably have this criterion where we'll probably have a much more liberal criterion because you're not worried about false alarms. You're worried more about misses. But if you were in a different situation, let's say that you were on a rescue team and you were told that there's somebody lost in the wilderness. There was a camper, they haven't reported in, they've been missing for a few days, and you go up in your helicopter and you see what you think is somebody, and you think maybe they're waving at me. In that scenario, that false alarm is not social embarrassment anymore, right? And that miss goes from maybe decreasing your relationship with somebody a little bit to maybe somebody dying. So that miss becomes massive. And what you would do is you would take your criterion and you would put it all the way to the left. And you would say, I got to get rid of all those misses. And I don't care if I have 100 false alarms. I don't care if I go down to this person and I say, oh, hey, are you the hiker that we're looking for that's missing? And they say, oh, no, I'm just doing my morning exercises. I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to get you guys down here. That doesn't matter, right? The cost of that particular false alarm, not very big, but the cost of a miss in a rescue situation, huge. So you're no better at detecting waves, but you take that criterion and you move it all the way to the left. All right, final scenario, and this is the one that we're going to stay on for a little bit. So this is about basically intimate relationships, taking a relationship to the next level, maybe initiating a relationship. This is where I, once again, looked up what are the terms that you can use for make a suggestion or proposal of an amorous relation. So this is when you decide that you're going to make a pass at somebody, that you're going to come on to somebody, that you're going to make advances to, that you're going to hit on, that you're going to make a play for. That is a yes or no decision, right? That is a decision where you take a look at somebody and you think to yourself, do I approach for whatever your intentions are? Do I approach or do I not approach? So we're going to keep this as academically clean as possible. So this is all about communicating and consent signals and just the idea that, again, you can take things that are very important in our society. And this is an important aspect of our society because without this, our society would not have a society anymore. We'd run out of people. That's pretty bad. So anyways, so we have this situation here and there's the idea of evidence. And what you are trying to do, if this is you making the decision, you're the person that sees somebody else and has to make that yes or no decision. Do I approach that person and make advances? Do I not approach that person and make advances? You have two situations. You have a situation where they are interested. So maybe you've been at that party and they're looking at you and they're a little shy and in their head they're thinking, oh my gosh, I hope they come over and talk to me soon. Oh my goodness, I am very interested in pursuing a potential relationship with that person, because that's how our minds work, it's quite possible that they are interested. It's also possible that they are not interested, that they are at that party and they're thinking to themselves, I just came here with my friends. I just want to be alone. I don't want to be approached tonight. I don't really want to deal with any of that kind of stuff. I just want to be with myself for now. Whatever it is, they are not interested. And you need to make that decision. So in this case, again, we're going to talk about the signal and the noise soon, but just kind of be correct on this. Let's label all four of these. So the hits are when you take a look at somebody and you say to yourself, you know what? I think that they're interested. So I'm going to go talk to that person, and they are interested. So that's a hit. The correct rejections are where you, in this social situation, and you take a look at a person and you think to yourself, they're not interested. They don't want to be approached tonight, and I'm not going to approach them. Correct rejection. The misses are when you take a look at somebody and they want to be approached, right? They've noticed you and they're kind of hoping that hopefully you're going to come over soon and maybe talk to them and strike up a conversation. But you take a look at them and you say, they're not interested. I'm not going to go talk to them. And that's a miss. And then the false alarms are the ones where you look at the individual and you say, you know what? I've been picking up signals. I've kind of gotten a little bit of this evidence. I think they want me to come over and talk to them. And you go over and you're like, hey, how you doing? And they're like, you know what? Not tonight. And you're like, thank you very much. And you leave. That's your false alarm. So in this case, before we get into some psychology studies that shed light on this, we kind of mentioned it when I said they've been sending signals. So what kind of stuff, what kind of behaviors would constitute evidence? And it's very important when we're dealing with this, and this is going to come up in our discussions about consent, it's very important to talk about the fact that evidence can occur when they're not interested, and they can occur when they are interested. So let's make this a little bit more psychologically safe. If you were the person that wanted somebody to come over and talk to you, what might you do? So you might make eye contact with the individual. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence, right? Does the person make eye contact with you? So if you really wanted somebody to come over, you might just continue to look at them until they make eye contact with you, and then would you immediately, when they make eye contact with you, just kind of look away and put your hand up? Would anybody do that? If they made eye contact to you, what might you do? You might smile. All right, I'm feeling a little bit of resistance here. So we'll just leave it at those two: eye contact and smile, right? I just want to be very clear on this. There are a million reasons why you might make eye contact with somebody. There are a million reasons why you might smile at somebody. And that's the reason why they're not interested there has evidence. Because that noise distribution is the person that maybe you think is making eye contact at you, but they're looking at the painting behind you, and at that distance, you can't really read that it's not your eye contact. And maybe they saw the painting behind you, and they noticed that it's the big N, and they smile because they remember that previous lecture, and they're like, oh, hey, there's that painting that our professor showed us. So they're smiling, they're making eye contact. It's evidence, but it's in a they not interested noise distribution. Yep.
It's considered noise if they're making eye contact with you. They're doing the thing you're looking for, but for another reason. Like if they're looking
Yes.
at you and they're looking at you because they're weirded out because you keep looking at them and they're like, what are they doing?
Yes. So the noise distribution is anything that is taken as evidence that is not when the signal is there. So the signal in this case is interest. And you're giving off signals that can be interpreted as interest. So if you're not interested, but you're doing things that can be interpreted as interest, that's noise. And if you're in a social situation, that stuff happens all the time, right? That's one of the difficult things in navigating, these sort of approach, do not approach situations. Because I'll be playing with you. A lot of the problems that we're going to see comes from a lot of evidence not being very good at indicating that somebody actually is interested. So if you think about what is one of the, I want to be very careful here, for anybody that got unwanted attention, unwanted advances towards them, what is one of the typical kind of blame the victim reasons why they might have gotten that attention? Yep. Their outfit. They clearly wanted to be hit on because they were wearing that particular outfit, right? It's a sexy outfit. It's a flirtatious outfit. Flirtatious literally has that assumption in it that it is evidence that they want to be flirted with. And it is quite possible that that individual is wearing that outfit and they are not interested. They just think they look great. They just got it and they wanted to wear it to a party, whatever the reason is. But that's part of the noise distribution. But it's also, and this is the thing about signal detection, this is why it's so important to get these definitions correct. It's also quite possible that they said to themselves, you know what, tonight I'm going to go and I'm going to get a relationship. I'm really trying to phrase this correctly. They're just like, you know what, tonight is the night. It's been too long. I'm going to this party. I am not leaving without a relationship. They go to their closet and they're like, that outfit, that's the one. Because they're sending evidence that they are interested. And this is why I'm really dancing around this. This is why laws around consent are so incredibly important, because as we can see, that noise distribution is there. And if the noise distribution wasn't there, then if we all agreed on what is evidence and what is not evidence, it would be a lot easier to not have false alarms and to not have misses. But unfortunately, in every system, even amorous relationship systems, there is always going to be noise. And we're going to see how we can deal with that. All right, so that's a good intro. Let's get into some actual data that will shed some more light on how we can use signal detection theory to understand relationships. So this is a study from 2011. It's called Waiting to be Asked, Gender, Power, and Relationship Progression Among Cohabiting Couples. So this is by Sassier and Miller. And what they did is they did a study where they took a look at cohabiting couples. So that is, I'll just be upfront with it, that's one of the limitations of this study, because they looked at couples that were already cohabiting with each other. And that is a very smaller subsection of just the general relationship world. But that being said, they did interview individuals and in a relationship. And let's just take a look at some of the highlights. They go, although only 11 couples in our sample described a formal date as the beginning of the relationship, 10 of these couples attributed the initiation of the relationship to the man. So in 10 out of these 11 couples, the initial initiation of the relationship, that initial yes decision, was made by the man in this relationship. And I should say that these are heterosexual relationships in this study. All right, more highlights. 7 couples described knowing they were in a romantic relationship because of a sign, a first kiss or more, leaving flowers in a locker, or the presentation of chocolates. So 7 of them had these really significant kind of markers that, oh, okay, we're boyfriend and girlfriend now. In 6 of these 7 couples, men were the instigators of these distinct but nonverbal signifiers. Other men expressed their interests. Other men expressed their interest in a romantic relationship. So that is the males. They were, in 6 of the 7 couples, instigating the initiation of that relationship or taking it to the romantic level in 6 out of those 7 couples that had that particular bright boundary of now we're in a relationship. Women, in contrast, were far more likely to rely on indirect strategies to transition friendship into romance. So we will get back to that a little bit further down. Several respondents revealed that women who pursued the first date or first sexual encounters with partners were, in the words of one rueful woman, shot down. And we're going to see exactly what's happening. But here we have a situation. Here we have a nice kind of psychological analysis of what is happening. Men initiating the most of the romantic relationships, men taking the romantic relationships up to the next level, and women using indirect strategies to transition from friendship into romance, and women that pursued that first date or that first sexual encounter were often shot down. So let's take a look at some of these and see what's going on here. So in this situation, again, we have exactly this scenario. Do you approach somebody or do you not approach somebody? Do you take that up? Do you take your relationship up to the next level or do you not take it? You know, are you just going to be friends? And again, we have that idea of that criterion and where do we set that criterion? So this is going to be for the males making a decision. And the decision that they're going to be making is to give a direct signifier to or don't give direct signifier to. So in this case, men have to decide, all right, I'm going to leave flowers in this person's locker. I want to, right? Do I do that or do I not do that? And again, if you give flowers and they see those flowers and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so great. We're going to start a relationship. That is giving a direct signifier to somebody that's interested. That's a hit. If on the other hand, you decide, you know what, not going to give them flowers. They're not really that interested. And they open up their locker and they're like, oh, phew, no flowers, because that's how you respond. That's a correct rejection. On the other hand, somebody might be waiting for flowers and you decide that whatever evidence they've been sending your way, that they're interested in a relationship, it's not enough, it's just noise, and that's a miss. And on the other hand, you might be thinking about somebody and thinking to yourself, you know what, they keep sending these little hints that they're ready to go to the next relationship, to the next level. I'm gonna buy some flowers, I'm gonna put them in their locker, let's get this going. And you put it in their locker and they're like, I think there's been a mistake. I think you sent me flowers and you probably shouldn't have. That's a false alarm. So one of the things that this study shows is that in our society, it is predominantly the responsibility of the males to make these decisions, right? Because again, remember in 6 out of the 7 couples that they interviewed that had those direct signifiers, it was the male that gave the direct signifiers. So this decision-making system here is predominantly the male responsibility in our society. And 10 out of the 11 couples that were interviewed, the males initiated the relationship. So once again, this is the decisions that males need to make in our society. Caveat, we're going to get to it. But in our society, they're the ones that have to decide, is somebody interested or is somebody not interested? And if they are, I will initiate the relationship. And if they're not, I will not. And then there's the hits, correct rejections, misses, and false alarms. All right, so any questions on what the study revealed about the signal detection theory analysis of what males are doing in an intimate relationship? All right. So now let's take a look at what the women are doing. So it goes, women in contrast were far more likely to rely on indirect strategies to transition friendship into romance. Indirect strategies are basically a way of not doing a direct strategy. So a direct strategy is leaving somebody flowers in their locker. An indirect strategy, I'm not entirely sure what those indirect strategies might have been, but another word that you can put for indirect strategies was evidence. So women in these relationships, they were far more likely to give evidence that, yes, I'm interested. And it's important to remember that all these women were interested because they all ended up in a relationship. That's how they ended up in this study. But they were all basically giving that evidence that they were interested. So in this case, what that would do for the male, again, this is the male making a decision. But if a woman is giving him evidence that she is interested, what that does to this signal detection theory paradigm here is it takes that signal and it amplifies it. It adds to the signal. It moves that signal plus noise, they are interested distribution from there to here. And what that means is that you have a lot less chance of actually missing this because that little miss area now, that little red area is not there anymore. And you have a lot, sorry, let me paraphrase that. And this is why, again, the signal detection theory paradigm allows you to really make these nice little observations. When we go from this to a person giving him evidence that they are interested, and it takes the situation from this to this, notice that the misses have gone down substantially, but the false alarms have not, right? So in this case, what signal detection theory is telling us is that when more evidence is given, the number of misses, people that want to be approached but are not getting approached, that's going to go down. The number of false alarms will not change. And that is actually something that I just noticed right now. And again, that's the power of analyzing things in this kind of signal detection scenario. All right, so don't initiate a relationship, initiate a relationship. So we'll move this a little bit further back here. And the last thing that I'll mention on this is that the more evidence that they can give, the more evidence that is given, the further apart those two distributions are, the fewer false alarms and misses you will have. So if this was a situation here, if we lived in a society where people were very clear, absolutely clear about whether they were interested or whether they weren't interested, then we would go from basically this situation here, where there's some misses and some false alarms, to this situation here, where we had enough sensitivity. And then you could just move your criterion and say, all right, let's move our criterion there. And now everybody that's interested is going to get a relationship initiated. Everybody that's not interested is not going to get a relationship initiated. And that is kind of your perfect world. Now, what does this kind of look like? I'm not entirely sure. I would imagine that in more ancient cultures or historically ancient cultures where there were matchmakers, where the parents would say, hey, we have a daughter of a certain age, and other parents would say, hey, we have a son of certain age, and we're going to get them together. Maybe that would be a situation like this, at least in the parents' eyes. They would for sure know what are the hits, and they would for sure know what are the misses. But again, these are the kind of questions that you can bring up if you apply a signal detection analysis to these kinds of situations. All right. When I read this article, one particular sentence stood out to me, and it was this one right here. And it goes, several respondents revealed that women who pursued the first date or first sexual encounters with partners were, in the words of one rueful woman, shot down. And what jumped out at me was the word rueful. You did not need to write that in this publication. That is a researcher who was really struck by how angry this woman was and decided I have to include that adjective to describe this woman to get across the full truth of what it was that I was experiencing. So in this scenario, what situation is that rueful woman in if she is getting shot down? So she's making a decision and she got shot down. Which of the 4 scenarios is that? Yep. That is a false alarm. Being shot down is a false alarm. Being shot down is saying, I'm going to approach this person because I think it's going to work. And then you go there and you say, hey, would you like to go on a first date? And the person goes, no. And you're like, well, great. You walk away. That's a false alarm. You thought there was a signal. There wasn't any signal. That's a false alarm. So this is a rueful woman. Why? Why is she rueful? Yep.
She thought she saw evidence and was upset that it didn't turn out the way she thought.
Okay, so she thought that she saw evidence and it didn't turn out the way that she thought. So that's a false alarm. And false alarms are, as we've seen so far, usually, oftentimes not a great experience, right? The false alarm can be socially embarrassing. The false alarm can be, can kind of sit with you for a while. I think a lot of us, if you take a look at the memories that you have of decisions that you made that went wrong, few of us ruminate on the misses. A lot of us ruminate on the false alarms. Those are the ones where you're like, I wish I could take it back. Like that wasn't, I shouldn't have done that. I should have taken it back. But let me pose this. Would one false alarm cause somebody to be rueful? Okay. Would 2 false alarms be enough? Probably not, right? This is clearly somebody with a lot of false alarms. This is clearly somebody that has tried for a bunch of opportunities, a bunch of individuals, and just been shot down over and over and over again. When you experience getting shot down over and over and over again, that's one of the things that can change you into a rueful woman, right? So what this basically means is that now that we're no longer talking about men making these decisions, but now we're talking about the scenarios where the woman made the decision. The woman had to decide, are they interested or are they not interested? And the woman needed to decide, should I initiate that relationship or should I not initiate that relationship? Again, we have a situation here where there's false alarms that led to ruefulness. And in that situation, you probably don't have few false alarms like that. What you probably have are false alarms like this, right? You probably have a lot of false alarms that are causing this to be rueful. However, even in this scenario here, we have a lot of false alarms, but look at all those hits. Do you think that this woman would be rueful if she was like in that study, she said, you know what? I keep asking guys out and I keep approaching them, asking them out for a first date. And look at my hits and my false alarms. All right. 1 time out of 4, they say no. Rueful, right? Do you think you'd be rueful if your success or your fail rate was 1 time out of 4? Probably not, right? That's not enough to get angry at the dating situation. That's not enough to, I keep coming back to the word, but it just pops out at you when you read it. Because again, the authors were like, no, we need that word in there. So what's going on here is that she can't possibly be having that many hits. How can we change this graph so that she's not getting that many hits? Yep. You move that signal distribution to the left. And moving that signal distribution to the left does 2 things. Number 1, it reduces the number of hits that she's having. So now you take a look at those false alarms, and they're almost as many as the hits, right? So now she is living in a situation where she has really almost no ability to predict who's going to say yes and who's going to say no, right? And if you take my learning course, you'll find experimentally induced psychosis, which is a procedure you can actually initiate in an experiment. It puts you in this situation where you have to make yes or no decisions, but you have no way of knowing should you go yes or should you go no. That's a very stressful situation. That could lead to ruefulness. But what does this say about the sensitivity of the women in this study, or at the very least this particular woman? What does this say about their sensitivity to signals that men are giving out as evidence of interest? Yep.
Either the men aren't giving out very many signals, or their sensitivity is just really not great.
So the suggestion was either the men are not giving out very good signals, or her sensitivity is not great. Actually, in this, it's both. It's both, because if men were giving out better signals or more clear signals, then that signal distribution there would move to the right. It would shoot off to the right because now there would be evidence that this particular individual could pick up on. The key here is, though, that whatever evidence males are producing, this person is not sensitive to, because those two distributions at the top of the distance between the top of those two distributions is very, very low. So this rueful woman would have way more success. It would not be as rueful if every person, every male in her social circle decided to wear a t-shirt that says, "I'm interested in a first date from anyone," or "I am not looking for a first date from anyone." If you did that, you would move that evidence way to the right. And that person, if they could read, would just take a look at it and say, "Not going to approach them, I'm going to approach them." And they would go up and they would say, "Hey, your t-shirt says you're open for a first date. You want to go out on Friday?" And they'd say yes. And you'd be like, "Sweet. I'm not rueful at all." We don't live in a society like that. At the very least, these individuals did not. And that's what that situation is. There is not enough evidence being given. And because of that, the sensitivity that this individual has, this rueful woman has, is not very sensitive. So she's getting a lot of false alarms, and she's getting a very few hits for those false alarms. Notice also, and again, this is an implication I didn't even think of, her misses have to be big. They just have to be. So she is missing out on people that would go out with her, but she's not asking them. So whatever it is, her signals that she's picking up and the evidence that she's considering is not very good. And that means that her sensitivity is extremely small. All right, so any final questions, comments, stuff about what we just took a look at? All right, so we didn't get to it, but we are going to, I do want to wrap this up by taking a look at some kind of society-wide implications that can be addressed with this signal detection paradigm. And it has to do with the Me Too movement. So we are going to dive into that next time. But just to kind of leave you with this challenge for next time, try to think about what was we'll go back here. What was this distribution like? And where was that criterion pre-Me Too? So before the Me Too movement, what did this distribution look like? And where was that criterion about who you approach and who you don't approach? Post Me Too, what was that distribution like and where was that criterion? And I'll give you a hint, the distribution did not really change very much. So where did that criterion move? And then on top of that, given what we know about signal detection theory, if we were going to improve things like work situations where we don't want people to get sexually harassed when they're at work, what can we do given the signal detection paradigm here in order to decrease the, I'll just give you an insight onto this, decrease the false alarms. So just to kind of give you a primer going into this, correct rejections, let's say that you're at work and you're faced with one of these four situations. Correct rejections is not sexual harassment, right? People not approaching you and not asking you to go out on a date with them, that's, a correct rejection. If you're interested and somebody asks you out, that's a hit. That's also not sexual harassment, at the very least, in terms of what HR defines it as. If you're interested in somebody and they don't ask you out at work, that's a miss. Also not sexual harassment. The one that's the issue is that false alarm. People who are not interested, and yet every day they go to work and people are like, hey, you want to go out for a drink? Hey, you want to do, hey, how about this? Date this Friday night? That's where the issues come. So just as a way to kind of frame your thinking, give you a little bit of hint, the false alarms are where the problems are. So we are going to take a look at that next time. So again, try to think of what did the distribution and the criterion look like pre-Me Too? What does the distribution and the criterion look like post-Me Too? And how can you make the situation better, specifically to reduce those false alarms? And we will take a look at that next time.